Hey guys, how you doing? In today's video we're going to be talking about some tips to help you win more gunfights in Call of Duty Warzone. Getting sent to the gulag is bad enough, but when you know that you should have won the gunfight, it just feels so much worse. Winning more gunfights will not only help you survive longer, but also allows you to start going for higher kill games with confidence that you're going to win every single fight that you get into. We'll be going over some tips and tricks to not only help you improve your gun mechanics, but also how to approach or even avoid certain tricky situations. We have 5 tips today, and the first one is about gun mechanics, or more specifically centering. When gun mechanics are generally talked about, most people either focus on aiming or tracking. It'd be easy to sit here and tell you to put hours and hours into an aim trainer to improve your tracking and flick shots, but let's be honest, it's really not that fun to do. Also, you definitely don't need a tip video to tell you that you could do that. Instead, let's talk about centering. Centering is basically your aim before you actually have to shoot someone. As you're moving around the map, you always want to be prepared for the next gunfight, in case someone pops out and surprises you. If you're running around the map looking at the floor or staring up at the sky, it'll take you significantly longer to pull your sights onto your opponent than if you're already looking in their general direction. Of course, you can't always predict exactly where someone might pop out from, but as you're moving around the map, make sure to have your crosshairs aimed at head level at the most likely place a person could be. This means if you are surprised, all you have to do is aim down sights and fire, rather than having to flick towards your opponent first, giving them a window to damage you before you're even aimed at them. Although having good centering isn't as flashy as being able to hit a fancy flick shot, it's a much more consistent way to win gunfights, as you'll always be the first one to deal damage. By avoiding flick shots, there's also a lot less to go wrong, as it's very easy to over or undershoot your target when you attempt to do them. This again gives your opponent more time to deal free damage to you. Precise centering is a good habit to get into, but what if you're looking to take the fight to your opponent? For the second tip, we're going to be looking at pre-aiming. Pre-aiming is basically a proactive use of centering. When you know you're about to get into an engagement with an enemy, you want to be aiming where you think they'll be. There are 2 main scenarios where you'll be pre-aiming, either when you're waiting for an enemy to push you, or when you're pushing an enemy. If you're waiting for an opponent to come through a door or round a corner, you want to be aiming slightly to the side of where you think the enemy will be coming from. You don't want to be aiming directly at the point where you think they'll appear, as it's likely they'll be moving pretty fast as they come into the room, so by the time that you've reacted to seeing them, they'll have already got past your crosshairs. By predicting and pre-aiming where they'll be after, say, half a second, all you have to do is fire rather than having to flick onto their new position first. We'll talk about some techniques that you can use to make it difficult for your opponent to be able to predict and pre-aim you later in the video. If you are pushing into a building or round a corner, there's an element of risk as you have no idea where your opponent might be. Unless you have a heartbeat sensor, the best way to reduce the risk is to pre-aim the most likely spot that you think the enemy might be. Say in a situation where you know an enemy is at the far end of a corridor, and you know that on one side of the corridor there's a stairwell and on the other side it's just a blank wall. In this situation, it's much more likely that the enemy will be using the stairwell as cover, so as you're coming around the corner, you want to be pre-aiming the side of the corridor where you most likely think they'll be. Tip number 3 is map knowledge, and it goes hand in hand with the pre-aiming. To effectively pre-aim, you need to have good map knowledge, but due to the size of the Warzone map, it's actually pretty difficult to have a mental image of every single possible area that you might be in. When I was learning the buildings on the map, I broke them down into 2 sections, the first being the random houses dotted around the map, and the second being larger locations. In terms of the random buildings, there's only a certain number of building layouts within the game, so once you've learned how each model is set out, you'll have a decent idea of where to pre-aim as you push in. For larger locations it's a bit trickier, as they tend to be uniquely designed, so you can't apply previous knowledge to help you learn the area. This makes these types of areas a bit more daunting to learn. The best way I've found to learn them is to choose 1 or 2 as your drop spot and land there until you're comfortable with their layout. Learning all the buildings at your drop spot is especially important as at the start of the game you're forced to clear buildings as part of the looting process. Once you're happy with those areas, you can move to different drop spots and learn them. This technique not only gives your game a bit more variety as you don't just land at the same place over and over again, but it also breaks down the map into more manageable chunks to learn. This tip will be especially useful when the new map comes out, whenever that is. Just know that even with perfect map knowledge and the best pre-aiming in the world, pushing blind into buildings is still pretty risky, and in most cases you're putting yourself at a disadvantage in the ensuing gunfight. It's a little bit annoying, but it's perfectly fine to leave campers in their buildings, and you can actually use their predictability to your advantage later in the match. Very passive players tend to only move when necessary, so you know that they're going to stay in the same spot until they're forced to move by the gas. By keeping an eye out on when campers are forced to move by the gas, you can position yourself between their location and the next zone, meaning that they're going to have to push into you for what should be an easy elimination. Sometimes the best way to win a gunfight is to be patient and outplay your opponent rather than just going in all guns blazing. I thought I'd quickly show you an example of this working. I'd spotted this guy a few minutes earlier on my UAV on my way to the airfield, and then after the next zone closed, it just so happened that this area was on the edge, so I wanted to check if there were any free kills on players trying to rotate across the river early, and I just happened to spot his sniper glint in the window. We skip forward a bit here to see if this person will be forced out of their house by the zone. As expected, they were, because they're right on the edge of the old zone, so if the new zone forms right touching that edge, you'd be pretty lucky. I know if my truck's nearby they'll be very cautious, so I take a wide rotation so I won't be on the minimap, and then as predicted, as I circle back, I spot the guy crossing the river. I actually don't take this engagement very well, as he wasn't fooled by the truck, so the fight was a little bit too close for comfort, but at least I made the fight a 50-50, rather than having to push into a house to clear him out, where I'd be at a severe disadvantage. Just before we get on to the next tip, if you're enjoying the video, make sure to like as it helps to get the content out there and the channel to grow. I'm currently making a series of tip videos, including how to choose where to land and how to increase your KD, so if one of those sounds interesting, check them out in the playlist on the end screen. Anyway, let's get on with the next tip. Whilst it's important to hit your shots during a gunfight, you also want to make it as hard as possible for your opponent to hit you. The best way to do this is either to have cover, or failing that, use your movement to make it difficult for your opponent to track you. In close range fights, the main movements that you can use are drop shots, jump shots, and slide cancelling, whereas at longer distances, just strafing as you shoot makes it so much harder for your opponent to line up headshots. In close range fights, these movements can be used in one of two ways, either to quickly reposition into cover, or to push your opponent. By jump shotting or slide cancelling round a corner or into a room, it just makes it so much more difficult for your opponent to be able to track your movement. Like we said in the previous tip, your opponent should be pre-aiming where they think you'll be coming from, so if you just walk around the corner, you'll be walking directly into their crosshairs, where they'll just have to aim down the sights and fire. Whereas, if you slide or jump into the same situation, you'll not only finish your movement past the point where the enemy is pre-aiming, you're also changing the height of your head. If you're slide cancelling, you'll be underneath their crosshair, and if you're jumping, your head should be above it. By forcing your opponent to not only flick to the side but also up or down at the same time, you're making it much more difficult for them to quickly get onto the target. Drop shotting is more of a defensive move and can be used to give you an edge in 50-50 fights. I've also found it to be pretty useful in fights when I've just jumped out of a vehicle. The fifth tip to win more gunfights is to listen. And no, I'm not just saying listen to my tips, although you definitely should, but listen in game. During a gunfight, things can get very loud and hectic, but by taking the time to use your ears as well as your eyes, you can gain important information about what your opponent is doing. If you hear your enemy reloading or putting on plates, you know that it's a perfect time to push into them, as their gun is going to be down, so you should be able to get an easy elimination. Same if you know an enemy is pushing the building that you're in and you hear them rip a Semtex, at that point they're vulnerable, so you should be able to peek and get some damage onto them. Every action in the game has a sound cue, so by listening out for them, you can outplay your opponent without even having to see them first. I hope these tips have given you some ideas that you can apply to your own game. Of course, we haven't been able to cover every scenario these tips will be useful in, as we'd probably be here for days, but hopefully I've explained the ideas well enough for you to be able to implement into your own gameplay. Just remember, gunfights should never be 50-50. There's almost always a way to give yourself an advantage rather than just relying on pure gun skill alone. Gun skill is obviously important, but by improving how you approach a gunfight, you'll start to become much more consistent. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. Thanks for watching.